In this second lecture on classic literature and the virtue of hope, we're going to be concentrating on Virgil's Aeneid, which was composed in the years before Virgil's death at Brindisi, Italy in 19 BC. Virgil had been commissioned to write the epic by Augustus Caesar, a matter of great controversy in the poem's interpretation. And when he died, it remained unfinished, without the final revisions and high polish Virgil would have wished. The story goes that on his deathbed, he asked that it be consigned to the flames. But luckily for European civilization, his request was not heeded. What would we be without the Aeneid? T.S. Eliot used it to define his understanding of what a classic is in its maturity, and particularly in its historical consciousness. As Eliot puts it, in Homer, the conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans is hardly larger in scope than a feud between one Greek city-state and a coalition of other city-states. Behind the story of Aeneas is the consciousness of a more radical distinction, a distinction which is at the same time a statement of relatedness between two great cultures, Greece and Rome, and finally of their reconciliation under an all-embracing destiny. From the very beginning of the Aeneid, Virgil makes his readers aware that his poem is very much what C.S. Lewis calls secondary epic. There's a frontier feel to it. I like to call it a Wyoming feel. It's part of what Lewis means by primary epic. The world is still surprised and delighted to find itself in a poem. It hasn't been endlessly written over, photographed, and toured. The Aeneid, by contrast, comes from an urban, mimetically sophisticated world, a kind of Paris or Manhattan. And Virgil is a massively accomplished poet who is secondary in the profound sense that he accepts and takes on and reshapes what he has received. That is, he assumes a written tradition, and his poem depends for its very shape and force on the existence of earlier epics that provide major patterns and images to form the backdrop for his own. The Iliad and the Odyssey are so present to the Aeneid that a reader coming to Virgil's poem can at first be tempted to dismiss it as merely derivative, which would be the hugest of mistakes. In thinking about the poem, I suggest that we keep two major settings in mind. One is the Rome of Virgil himself, the center of an empire that stretches east and south from France and Germany across Western Europe to Greece and Asia Minor, then south through the Middle East to Egypt and back west over much of North Africa. In the wake of many years of civil war, Augustus Caesar now rules as emperor. The old Roman Republic is dead. The Roman Senate, a mere shadow of its former glory. But as Roger Kimball writes in a recent book review, the Roman Republic, devised to govern a city-state, was overwhelmed by the cosmopolitan responsibilities of empire. By Caesar's day, the Republic was a tottering and deeply corrupt edifice. Under Augustus, for the first time in Rome's history, there is almost universal peace, the famous Pax Romana, under which Christ himself was born. In a real sense, the occasion of the Aeneid is the establishment of this worldwide peace under Rome's first real, if unacknowledged, monarch since the defeat of the Tarquins many centuries earlier. The gates of war have been shut at last, as Jupiter predicts to Venus in Book 1 of the Aeneid. And in the poem, this peace appears as the culmination of a 1,000-year plan whose first difficult steps the poem narrates. Rome is the center of the world. This is one setting, then. And the other is its opposite. Virgil asks us to imagine the destruction of Troy, a great city embodying many of the virtues Romans themselves espouse, in an action that neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey narrates. Its walls have been breached, its buildings destroyed, its men slaughtered, its women and children enslaved by the victorious Greeks. One man has been singled out by the gods to take the survivors of this destruction from the burning city and convey them safely to Italy, where there will be a new founding whose eventual outcome will be the city of Rome. As a contemporary writer in Manhattan might take us back to the early Dutch settlers, Virgil takes us back to the legendary beginnings of Rome. Virgil has to keep these two settings in constant relation, constant tension. He also has to come to terms with the relatedness and distinction of the two cultures, Greek and Roman. It is a huge task to write an epic about the primitive founding of Rome that grounds itself in the Greek story of Troy's destruction, but without being Greek in sympathy. From the Trojan side, Virgil has to justify the Trojan loss by making the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean world supplant, but also complete, the Greek victory in the Trojan War. As Aeneas' mother Venus tells Jupiter, "I consoled myself for Troy's fall, that grim ruin, weighing out one fate against another in the scales." In other words, she can accept the fall of Troy because it leads to the founding of Rome. As the poet of this great shift, Virgil has to follow Homer in such a way that his vision supersedes Homer's and perhaps even displaces it. At the very least, he has to make Homer's narrative feel incomplete without his. In my lecture on Homer, I defined epic hope as a special instance that falls between merely natural hope and Christian theological hope. Natural hope is necessary, but it is often diluted in its objects. Thucydides rightly says, as I noted last time, that it is a habit of mankind to entrust to careless hope what they long for, and to use sovereign reason to thrust aside what they do not desire. In other words, we make reasonable sounding excuses for letting ourselves hope for an unlikely outcome, whether on a personal level or on a larger civic one. There are many characters in epics, Patroclus and Hector among them, who indulge this false hope, not to mention the 108 suitors of Penelope, each one of whom foolishly hopes to marry her. Epic hope, however, has a different nature because it is grounded in extraordinary magnanimity, greatness of soul, that merits divine prompting and guidance. It is restrained by the hero's humility in recognizing the limits of man before the gods. The goddess Athena herself initiates Odysseus' journey back to Ithaca and serves him as a guide and guarantor of the homecoming he hopes for. But Virgil's hero Aeneas adds a new dimension to what I mean by epic hope. So much so that the closest comparison to him in our tradition might be Moses, who also leads a whole people into a new place, promised but as yet unseen. Far from choosing his mission, Aeneas, like Moses, finds himself singled out for it. All Aeneas wants to do on the night that Troy falls is go back into the city and die fighting against the Greeks. But two interventions give him a new direction. First, the ghost of Hector, who tells him to save the household gods of Troy. And then the ghost of his own wife, Creusa, who gives him the commission to undertake the new founding in Italy. Nothing of this huge endeavor is of Aeneas' own choosing. The gods themselves have ordained it. In fact, this mission was already known to Homer long before Rome was even founded. In Book 20 of the Iliad, Poseidon saves Aeneas from being killed by Achilles because he is destined to save the seat of Troy. And Virgil shows what it was saved for. Founding Rome is by no means the hope of Aeneas himself, in other words. It is the epic hope, the hope of an entire people that he is given to carry, almost as he carries his aged father Anchises from the city of Troy. It is not hope as his own natural, internal aspiration, but hope as something added to his own magnanimity and difficult to internalize. Reluctantly, uncertainly, Aeneas becomes the model for epic hope per se. Remember St. Thomas's 4 characteristics of the object of hope. It must be in the future, must be good, must be difficult to attain, and it must be possible. Aeneas' whole action moves toward a good hidden from him so far in the future that he cannot experience it except in prophecy. Not just the little seaside settlement that was the first foothold of the Trojans in Italy, but the eventual founding of the city of Rome and its culmination in the Roman Empire under Augustus. For Aeneas to succeed at a task whose momentous consequences continue all the way into our own day will be so difficult as to be at the outer limits of the possible, especially because he is opposed at every step by the goddess Juno. We know it had to be possible, however, because it came about. But it was by no means certain that it would come about when it was first undertaken. Neither was the composition of the poem certain. I want to consider two things then. First, the kind of hope it took for Virgil to write the Aeneid. And second, how Aeneas comes to own this epic hope, whose endeavor to bring the Trojan survivors to Italy constitutes the major action. Let's start by imagining Virgil himself as he faces the prospect of writing this epic. The future good that he seeks is complex. If he succeeds, the poem itself will give the Roman people a new founding story for centuries to come, a way for each one incorporating its story to participate imaginatively in what it took for Rome to become Rome. Moreover, the fame that will come from having written it will immortalize Virgil, again, if he succeeds. Few things can compare in difficulty to the endeavor he has before him as he starts to write the first true narrative epic since Homer. And because of the historical distance between the earlier poet and himself, Virgil's task is even greater still. He has to incorporate 700 or 800 years of history into the poem in such a way that the newly unified Rome under Augustus Caesar imaginatively coincides with the mythical founding of Rome by Aeneas. And it can't seem to be propaganda. No, it can't be propaganda because the task is larger than merely pleasing Augustus. The task of this epic is to refound Rome imaginatively, to transform the history of a city that has already existed for almost 800 years and give Rome a new providential self-understanding. In the centuries between Virgil and Homer, Europe and Asia have seen the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus, the Persian wars against Greece under Darius and Xerxes, as recounted by Herodotus, the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, explored by Thucydides, and later the rise of Alexander and the spread of his empire. Meanwhile, Rome has grown through constant warfare, from a single city in Italy to the greatest power in the Mediterranean world, largely through the huge impetus it gained in the Punic Wars against Carthage. During Virgil's lifetime came the conquest of most of what we now call Europe by Julius Caesar, then the Roman civil wars, first between Pompey and Caesar, then between the conspirators who assassinated Caesar in 44 BC and the forces of Octavius and Antony opposing them. And finally, there was civil war between Octavius and Antony themselves, ending for all practical purposes in Antony's great naval defeat at Actium in 31 BC. In the struggles of the previous century, Rome has metamorphosed from a republic to a monarchy, a matter of moral agony to men like Cicero, Cato, and Brutus. And Virgil not only has this history to include in the poem, largely by prediction and allusion, but he also has centuries of high cultural achievement in poetry and philosophy to acknowledge and incorporate. Not only Homer, but Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Plato, for example, among the Greeks, Lucretius and Cicero among the Romans. Virgil has to write both for a naive audience that he must interest in the story and for a highly sophisticated audience, much more aware of cultural currents than Homer's original audience could possibly have been. He has to undertake a Roman incorporation and remaking of Greek culture, while at the same time he's accomplishing an Augustan remaking of earlier Roman modes. He has to make Homer Roman, but he also has to make the older, rougher Roman forms Trojan to make them more artistic and beautiful without undermining solid Roman virtue. Is it even possible to write such an epic? Only if there's something providential in the attempt itself, only if it has some kind of divine support and not just official support from the emperor. This at least would be Dante's take on it. The poet has to be an unparalleled master of the craft of poetry and profoundly learned in many other disciplines to undertake it at all. Most importantly, he has to live long enough in an uncertain world to complete it. And as we've seen, he did not quite do so. From the beginning, Virgil was reluctant to take on the task. He was essentially a nature poet, the author of the Eclogues and the Georgics. Like Milton, he could say that he was not sedulous by nature to indict wars, hitherto the only argument heroic deemed. In this regard, he was very much unlike the Homer of the Iliad. Yet to finish the poem, he had to write about wars, not only the fall of Troy, but also the wars between Aeneas and the native Italians that occupy the second half of the poem. It is easy to see why many critics have identified Virgil with Aeneas himself. Virgil never asked to be an epic poet, and the hero of his Aeneid never asked to be an epic hero, as Achilles and Odysseus more or less did. Rather, the task of taking the survivors of Troy to Italy and founding a new city is enjoined upon Aeneas on the night that Troy burns, as he tells Dido in Book 2. Again, this destiny, this fatum, has little or nothing to do with his personal inclinations. The unasked for task, dutifully undertaken, is later validated and reinforced by prophecies and warnings from the gods. But the question is how the irascible passion of hope can arise if it does not originate from that keen sense of oneself that underlies anger and questions of honor. For example, Achilles obviously does not want to die, but when his mother tells him that he will die shortly after killing Hector, he pursues and kills Hector anyway, because his magnanimity drives him to avenge Patroclus. Odysseus does not want to sail a raft over the endless salt water, never sleeping for almost 3 weeks. He doesn't want to swim for 2 days after Poseidon wrecks his raft, but he does it because his great-souled passion for homecoming gives him the strength to endure any hardship. In these cases, a strongly personal passion underlies hope. But what strong personal passion drives Aeneas? Piety. Pietas. In Book 1, he calls himself duty-bound. The question is how magnanimity coincides with the sense of obligation, both to the gods and to a people. In other words, how the free self-determination of the hero can be reconciled to limitations imposed from outside his own will. It's difficult to feel that either Achilles or Odysseus acts out of duty, for example, because in neither case does it seem primary. Achilles doesn't avenge Patroclus out of duty, for example, but out of a superhuman rage at his friend's killer. Odysseus doesn't go home out of duty to his wife and son, but out of a desire to recover his free self-determination. But with Aeneas, we feel duty as duty very keenly. One of the difficulties of reading the poem in our age is that the word duty has lost the once golden connotation which it had even for William Wordsworth. As a romantic poet who had been very much an advocate of doing whatever his natural impulses prompted him to do, Wordsworth underwent a startling turn when he wrote Ode to Duty as he came to the end of his youth. He called duty stern daughter of the voice of God and went on to ask of her these gifts. Give unto me, maid lowly wise, the spirit of self-sacrifice, the confidence of reason give, and in the light of truth, thy bondsman let me live. I can't resist mentioning that Ogden Nash answered Wordsworth in kind of an ode to duty, which begins very differently. O duty, why hast thou not the visage of a sweetie or a cutie? Why glitter thy spectacles so ominously? Why art thou clad so abominously? Why art thou so different from Venus? And why do thou and I have so few interests mutually in common between us? Nash's view, of course, prevails today in the culture at large. People tend to see duty as something ugly and imposed from without, a set of rules to be followed, a number of quotas to be met. It's difficult now to understand duty as an intensely inner consecration of self to a higher good. As a native Southerner, I think of how hard it is to understand Robert E. Lee. He was neither a secessionist nor a supporter of slavery, but he held his duty to Virginia just beneath his duty to God, and what Virginia decided, he obeyed. Why would Lee be loyal to his state instead of to the higher good of union or to the principle of human freedom? We would have to reconstruct his world, his sense of kinship and place, as his biographers have tried to do, in order to understand the kind of virtue he undoubtedly possessed. Thinking about Lee next to Aeneas reveals something about the high nature of duty, or pietas. The difficulty for Hope, however, is that Aeneas's real loyalties all lie in the past, as he tells Dido in a crucial scene. If fate permitted me to spend my days by my own lights and make the best of things according to my wishes, first of all, I should look after Troy and the loved relics left me of my people. Priam's great hall should stand again. I should have restored the tower of Pergamum for Trojans in defeat. In other words, everything that Aeneas really loves has already been lost. His city, his wife, his father. But now he moves toward a future enjoined upon him, and his hope truly verges on the theological. But now it is the rich Italian land Apollo tells me I must make for, Italy, named by his oracles. There is my love. There is my country. How can he love what he's never seen? How can he call his country his home, a place where he has never been, very much unlike Odysseus and Ithaca? It must be in something like the way that Moses lives in a status viatoris, a not yet with respect to the promised land, or the way that Christians live with respect to heaven. As St. Paul writes in Romans 8, now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When Aeneas first comes to Carthage, he lacks this clarity of vision and this sense of hopeful purpose. The Aeneid begins at his lowest point. The troubles of the journey and the immensity of the task have made Aeneas lose sight of this future good. His father has just died in Sicily, and after the funeral, Aeneas intends to sail directly from Sicily to western Italy. But baleful Juno, who hates everything Trojan, catches his fleet in a terrible storm that drives his ships in the opposite direction, all the way to Africa. Blown ashore in an unknown place, having lost most of his ships, Aeneas finds food for his men and brings it back to the beach. In his speech to them, Aeneas reminds his men of the hard hours and greater dangers they've been through and urges them to call back their courage. Someday, perhaps, remembering even this will be a pleasure. Through diversities of luck and through so many challenges, we hold our course for Latium, where the fates hold out a settlement and rest for us. Troy's kingdom there shall rise again. Be patient. Save yourselves for more auspicious days. So ran the speech. Burdened and sick at heart, He feigned hope in his look and inwardly contained his anguish. He feigned hope in his look, Virgil says. Dante has Virgil himself feign hope at a certain point in their descent through hell in the Inferno. Feigning hope is a way of appealing to the natural hope of others because their despair would be disastrous. Milton picks up the sense of these lines in Book 1 of Paradise Lost, when Satan boasts to Beelzebub that all is not lost, even though both of them are lying prostrate in the lake of fire in hell after being defeated in heaven. As Satan ends his stirring speech of defiance, the poet comments, "So spake the apostate angel, though in pain, vaunting aloud, but racked with deep despair." Here on the shores of Africa, Aeneas might be close to a similar despair. He fears that he's been indulging a deluded hope. He's been traveling from Troy for 7 years, and every attempt he's made to interpret the divine will and do what he's been asked has been thwarted. Now, almost within sight of his goal, he's been blown far off course yet again. And at this point, the future good that he can imagine seems very minimal, a settlement and rest for us, not the future glory of Rome. He doubts the whole enterprise. The boast that Troy's kingdom will rise again, a boast he's often made before, sounds hollow. But this near despair is a familiar situation in epics. At the beginning of the Iliad, Achilles is insulted and stripped of his war prize by Agamemnon, and he has to call on his mother to appeal to Zeus for his honor. As we saw in the first lecture, Odysseus begins the poem weeping on the beach of Calypso's island, longing for home. As we'll see next time, Dante tries unsuccessfully to make his way up the hillside from the dark wood, where he has found himself lost at midlife. In each case, the near despair of the hero leads to a divine intervention in the advent of epic hope. Here in Book 1 of the Aeneid, Aeneas' mother Venus intervenes on behalf of duty. Ogden Nash to the contrary. First, she confronts Jupiter, asking him whether he lied about her son's destiny. From the height of heaven, Jupiter assures the worried goddess that her son is still moving toward his destiny. He sketches in the future of Rome all the way to Julius Caesar and the Pax Romana under Augustus. Of the Roman people, Jupiter says, "For these I set no limits, world or time, but make the gift of empire without end." Venus descends and appears to Aeneas in disguise as a Carthaginian huntress, one of Dido's followers. She tells him the story of Dido, an exile from her original home in Phoenicia, who's building the new city of Carthage. When Aeneas complains about his circumstances, Venus tells him she doubts that heaven is unfriendly to him since he's survived so far. She brings him the good omen of the swans, which he interprets to mean that his other ships are safe, reviving his hope in the larger enterprise on behalf of his people. Yet it's also Venus who is intimately involved with Aeneas' entanglement with Queen Dido. She hides Aeneas from sight until the perfect moment for Dido to be most impressed by him, which isn't unreasonable. But then instead of having Dido merely offer support and respite for Aeneas' men, she has her son Amor, better known to us as Cupid, inflame Dido with erotic desire for Aeneas. The resulting passionate affair, which Dido considers a marriage, ends up delaying Aeneas for a full year. Why would Venus do this if she wants to help her son get to Italy? It's hard to say. There's no suggestion that Venus understands the larger scheme in which the dying enmity of Dido will make Carthage the greatest enemy of Rome. But Venus aside, what Virgil does in this unforgettable sequence of the poem is to suggest a brilliant parallel between Dido in the Aeneid and Calypso in the Odyssey. Leaving Dido behind becomes the greatest test for Aeneas, as Carthage will later be the greatest test for Rome. Far more than Odysseus with Calypso, there would be many advantages to his staying with her. She has a city already underway where Aeneas and his people can find a settlement and rest, if that's all they're after. If they stay, as she invites them to, Carthage will be the child of both Troy and Tyre. With Trojan soldiers as companions in arms, by what exploits will Trojan glory grow, says Dido's sister Anna. Whereas in Italy, Aeneas still faces the uncertainty of what he will find. Like Calypso with Odysseus, Dido accepts this man who washed up on her shores. She offers him rest and care and a new life with her, asking of him only to give up the life he might have led elsewhere. But Aeneas cannot stay with her and also obey the oracles and prophecies of the gods. If he stays, everything will be her gift rather than the fruit of his own effort, a problem for his magnanimity. And in this regard, Dido most closely resembles Calypso. Calypso, though, is an obscure goddess whose name means to cover up, to eclipse. But Carthage is by no means an island in the middle of nowhere. And Dido is the leader of a whole people, a public person engaged in an epic enterprise of her own. For her, Aeneas is the famous hero already depicted in the artwork on the Temple of Juno, a man worthy of her aspirations and an unlooked-for consummation of her hopes. How princely, how courageous, what a soldier, as she describes him to her sister. But Aeneas himself is passive with respect to her, not active. Again, a parallel to Odysseus with Calypso. Virgil underscores the similarity when he has Mercury come from Jupiter, as Hermes came from Zeus, to rouse Aeneas from his affair, remind him of his true calling, and so reawaken his sense of purpose. The messenger god sees the situation. Aeneas is laying foundations for new towers and homes, and he is wearing robes aglow with Tyrian dye upon his shoulders, gifts of the wealthy queen who had inwoven gold thread in the fabric. He addresses the famous hero in a few scathing lines. Is it for you to lay the stones for Carthage's high walls, tame husband that you are, and build their city, oblivious of your own world, your own kingdom? Aeneas' stay in Carthage reminds us once again of the danger of Acedia that the epic tradition always acknowledges, even in its pre-Christian form. In my lecture on Homer, I argued that Calypso tempts Odysseus to forget his nobility of being and his true nature, and the result is a state of sadness that would become despair if the hero were not open to divine help. Joseph Pieper says that Acedia as a mortal sin is the temptation to shake off the obligations of that nobility of being that is conferred by Christianity, and so to deny one's true self. Calypso and Dido both tempt the pre-Christian epic hero to shake off the obligations of the nobility of being that he carries, and so to deny the full dimensions of his epic task. Aeneas comes much closer to this denial, I would argue, than Odysseus does with Calypso, perhaps because the good he pursues lies in an unseen future, not in coming home to a known world. Joseph Pieper reminds us that hope becomes a virtue only when it is theological. But epic hope, as I've said before, certainly looks like virtue, and it costs a great deal in terms of ordinary human satisfactions. Aeneas' departure under divine orders leads Dido to despair and kill herself at the very moment when his journey toward Italy is at last resumed and the mission at last begins to take on greater power and reality. Aeneas' grief about her death seems altogether genuine when he speaks to her shade in the underworld in Book 6. I left your land against my will, my queen, he tells her. The gods' commands drove me to do their will. He rediscovers his epic hope, so to speak, against his personal will, which makes his duty appear as a denial of self in keeping with the higher nobility of his true nature. Duty requires self-sacrifice, and precisely this renunciation of self makes the temptation to slothful sadness more understandable. In particular, the renunciation of present enjoyment, whose symbol in both the Odyssey and the Aeneid is erotic passion, might be the most consistent and compelling dimension of epic hope, as well as the aspect of it that gives it a sacrificial cast. Epic hope, like theological hope, demands the virtue of self-sacrifice. The noble future good necessarily comes at the expense of the ease and pleasure of the present moment. The irascible passion of hope for this great future good must burn through the concupiscible passions. As Thomas puts it, hope does not regard that which is present and already possessed. In this respect, hope differs from joy, which regards a present good. Achilles lets Agamemnon's men take away his war prize, Briseis, at the beginning of the poem, because he will not let his insulted honor be confused with his desire for the girl. He gives up his enjoyment of her because of his hope to be redeemed in reputation. Odysseus seems to be a counterexample because of his striving to get back home to Penelope. But I think the sacrificial principle holds. Twice, once with Circe and again with Calypso, he has been given the love of a goddess, and yet he yearns steadily for the mortal wife who cannot match them in beauty and stature. The love of Odysseus is not passionate, of Odysseus and Penelope is not passionately erotic like that of Dido and Aeneas or Paris and Helen, the great examples of concupiscible passion. Rather, it is stable and conjugal. It's a kind of friendship, and its symbol is the bed rooted in the earth. Not for the epic hero is the kind of love that makes all conventions seem empty and all duty hollow. Some of the world's greatest novels, such as Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, center on such love, but they are not epics, and the hope for fulfillment that they depict is always a delusion of acedia, never a parallel to the virtue of hope. Aeneas sails from Carthage back to Sicily, where he arrives just in time to celebrate the anniversary of his father's death. While he is there, Juno incites some of the women to set fire to the Trojan fleet, and Aeneas loses a number of his ships. At the suggestion of one of his friends, he decides to leave behind all those who do not want to go back to sea and undertake yet again the trials of the journey toward their destined place near the mouth of the Tiber. With just those young and eager enough to take on the challenge, he heads again toward Italy, coming ashore near Cumae, where he undertakes a descent into the underworld in Book 6. There he meets his father Anchises, who gives him a vision of the Roman future and arouses his pietas for an order that remains unseen. In Book 8, as he prepares to fight against the native Italians stirred against him by Juno, his mother Venus brings him a shield depicting once again the Roman future, including Augustus' victory over Antony at Actium, none of which Aeneas understands. But the point is this. In the second half of the poem, he has deeply internalized his duty, and he never again wavers in his epic hope. He moves against Turnus and Mezentius, his enemies, with great-souled resolve, and does what he must do to carry out this divinely given destiny, just as Virgil does in completing the massive effort of the poem, whether or not to his own satisfaction. It's interesting that in Dante's Purgatorio, on the terrace of Sloth, or Acedia in Italian, the Trojans who stayed behind in Sicily are singled out for chastisement by the souls undergoing correction for Acedia. They're characterized as, quote, those who did not suffer trials until the end, together with Anchises' son, and gave themselves up to life without renown, unquote. In other words, they lacked the magnanimity of hope necessary for completing the journey. They lacked the epic spirit. They got old. Joseph Pieper writes that natural hope grows weary with age because the not yet is turned into the has been, and old age turns not to the not yet, but to memories of what is no more. On the other hand, he writes, the opposite is true for supernatural hope. Nothing, he says, more eminently preserves and founds eternal youth than the theological virtue of hope. It alone can bestow on man the certain possession of that aspiration that is at once relaxed and disciplined, that adaptability and readiness, that strong-hearted freshness, that resilient joy, that steady perseverance and trust that so distinguish the young and make them lovable. To hope in this sense is to be made young again, a phenomenon we will explore next time in thinking about theological hope and the Christian epic of Dante Alighieri.